Chapter 25. Postmortem. Nolan sat quietly in the hallway near Stiles' room. He couldn't bear the sight of a father waiting for his son to rise awake again. The young man thought he should allow him some space to express his feelings in the peace and quietude he deserved. Noah Stilinski had indeed seen and been through his fair share of hardships and struggles, both as a man but also as the sheriff of such town that is Beacon Hills, all of which he had to learn to live with. What he couldn't overcome, however, was every parent's fear, a possibility in life that almost all dreaded, outliving their own children, or worse, having to bury them. Most should agree that nobody needed to go through something like that, yet most should accept that it will be part of reality for some. Stiles, you gotta get up. He couldn't find better words to utter as he gazed upon his unconscious son. We need you. We all do. He wasn't a defeatist by any means, but judging by the abnormally excessive sweating and dark purple circles under Stiles' eyes, no one knew he could toss the idea of him simply sleeping peacefully out the window. He could feel his struggle underneath all those deep layers of slumber. Whatever you're going through, whatever you're seeing deep down there, I know you can beat it. I know you can make it out of there. Did he know that for sure? Even he couldn't tell. He just wanted to hold his son, have a conversation with him, hear his voice, see his smile. It had been years since he could do so, but with all of that, he still was very proud of his courage and accomplishments. He had doubts about it, but when the sheriff looked at the impact Stiles had on so many people's lives around him, he definitely knew he did a good job at raising his child. I'm sorry, Noah muttered, before turning aside and discreetly wiping his tears. He'd heard footsteps coming his way. Melissa walked into the room and headed straight towards Stiles to check on his state. As she passed Noah, she mustered a little "hey" and a sympathetic smile on her face. He returned the gesture, then proceeded to ask her, "No improvement?" "I'm not sure, to be honest. This doesn't really make any sense. He should have been up by now," she said as she examined his vitals. Noah took a deep breath, brought his right hand onto his eyelids and massaged them. "So this is supernatural?" he asked. "It does seem like it. I'm sorry." Her answer was brief, and again, she didn't know what else to say. Stilinski was a close friend. She wasn't going to give him the same comfort speech she was used to giving patients and their families. "I will join you and Deaton at the morgue in a little while." He seemed to catch on to her thoughts, thus he decided to change the subject. "All right, I'll be heading there now," she said before exiting the room. As she crossed the door, she came face to face with Chris, who seemed to be looking for her. "Is she up?" asked Melissa about the woman he was keeping an eye on. "Yeah, she did say some interesting things, but not as much as I'd hoped," he answered before adding, "I need to catch up to Scott. Apparently, Monroe is dead." A moment of speechlessness followed suit as she took the time to digest the news. It was a rather odd sensation to hear about the death of the person who had been tormenting them for a major part of the recent past years. "I need to get going, but keep your eyes open. For anything, really." His voice snapped her back out to reality. She looked him in the eyes, and he held her gaze. They both could discern all the emotions bottled up deep within themselves, yet very little of those feelings bubbled up to the surface. Neither one knew which to express and how. "I'll go with you." Nolan stood at some distance behind Melissa. He had just broken the intense moment between the two of them. "Be careful out there," was all she found to say. I always am, he replied, before heading towards the exit with Nolan. It seems you were right, Mason. Earlier tonight when you made the connection between what happened to Theo and the creatures that attacked these hunters, stated Deaton as he flipped through the autopsy report pages for one of the bodies discovered earlier that night. So the difference may be that Theo is not human, intervened Corey. Yeah, the black blood could be his body's attempt at healing. Mason thought back to what Derek had told him about the healing process for supernaturals, more specifically werewolves. He'd explained that when something prevented their healing, the symptoms tended to manifest through the discharge of rancid black blood. The others healed up pretty quickly compared to him, though. Liam said right as Melissa appeared through the door to the morgue. She heard the last thing that was said, so she decided to contribute with an answer. That could be because Theo is not supernatural, but a chimera. And the hunters died almost immediately, added Deaton. They all remained silent for a moment, each dwelling around their own contemplations until Melissa spoke again. The autopsy suggests that the cause of death is the presence of large doses of venom in their system. That statement opened the doors to a swarm of new possibilities and theories. What kind of venom? Liam asked. Scorpion venom, replied Deaton. His eyes happened to fall on the answer right on time for Liam's question. As if someone lit a light bulb in Corey's head, he immediately opened his mouth to speak when he felt he needed to share his realization. I think I've experienced this kind of venom before. Lucas, uttered Mason. The guy we fought at the nightclub cinema? Liam remembered that night him and Brett had a confrontation with the Scorpion Chimera, before Scott and Kira joined them to help. The Scorpion Chimera you told me about? Alec wasn't sure if they were talking about the encounter he was thinking of, since he was the last to join the party. He could only rely on the tales conveyed by those who had been there before him. I remember saying it was sort of a miracle that you were still alive, Melissa spoke, looking Corey's direction. Because he was already a chimera at the time, Mason followed behind her words. Didn't stop me from seeing the red rivers of pain from hell. Corey chuckled at his own anecdote. Another moment of silence fell in the room before Deaton's voice broke it again. The healing process for chimeras is slower and less effective. We did establish that before, with Hayden. At those words, Liam proceeded to shed more light on the matter, considering he was one of the only people in that room to have dealt with the set creatures they were speculating about. Yeah, but these didn't look anything like Luca, or any other chimera we saw. They had unnatural shapes, yeah, but they weren't shifters. They were basically just monsters, Alec added. True that was, their attackers appeared in one shape, then departed in that same one. In a way, they resembled berserkers. Those two didn't seem to have a mind of their own, like they were being controlled by a being of a higher intelligence to theirs. But that remained only a theory at that time. Chapter 26. Nemesis. Liam wasn't sure where he should be heading. After leaving the morgue, that is. He knew where Scott and Brayton were. He knew what they discovered in that basement. He also knew that Chris and Nolan were going their way. He thought he wasn't going to be needed there. He didn't particularly want to see Monroe's carcass either. He wished he could have confronted her in her time among the living. There was no use to it once dead. The idea of joining Lydia and the new banshee crossed his mind, but before he could linger on it, he noted that he was walking by Theo's room. There he lied motionless, unaware or perhaps aware of his surroundings, just unable to interact or open his eyes for that matter. An odd sensation overcame Liam at that moment. A few images escaped his memory box and flashed before his eyes, images of his and Theo's adventures together, if one could call them that. Their relationship had always been complicated. Liam contemplated the state of it from time to time. Come to think of it, he never dwelled on it long enough to put an overall label on it. Were they friends? Why did the word friend feel so heavy to think about towards Theo? And perhaps a nemesis? It's hard to imagine seeing him like that. Alex stopped him in his train of thoughts. What do you mean? Liam answered after realizing he was no longer in the hallway, but standing by one of Theo's bedsides instead. Well, you said that you started off as enemies. His words couldn't be any truer than that. They really were the worst of enemies before. Alec walked to the other side of the bed as he spoke those words. Liam seemed to be deliberating and picking his next words, not sure what or how to lay them out. Yeah, we did. He manipulated all of us to turn on Scott, he said eventually. You had the worst part in his play. He pushed you far enough to kill. Alec was referring to the fact that Liam had almost killed Scott in a fit of uncontrollable rage. I think about it from time to time. Each time I come back to the conclusion that it wasn't really the only factor. It was hard for Liam to admit that, but the more he reflected on that part of their history, the less he blamed Theo for his actions that night. The intent of them, at least. I get that. Alec nodded simply. Right now, the only thing on my mind is what he said about chimeras not being able to heal like us. He revealed. The worried look he had never left his face the entire duration of their dialogue. You're worried? Well, I don't necessarily want him to die. Liam felt a bit exposed after Alec's question. Though worrying about Theo's well-being wasn't the most embarrassing thing to own up to, he immediately switched back to his concerned demeanor. What if he needed help? Alec broke the silence that chiseled in after Liam's response. You said that in order to trigger the healing process, we needed to feel pain, but you also said that sometimes too much pain can cause our abilities to halt. Yeah, I can try that. The blond man set his right hand on Theo's forearm. Black veins began to protrude on the chimera around the area of contact between the two of them. The black blood vessels extended towards Liam's arm quickly enough. The breathing of the patient became uneven as he inhaled deeply and only exhaled shortly. Alec noticed Liam's struggle taking his pain. His agony was clearly greater than they previously thought. Let's do it together? He instantly put his hand on Theo's other arm, mimicking Liam's action. And sure enough, the black veins also appeared on his side. The young wolf was hit with a searing throb in his skull, grilling burning sensation around the chest area and a foreign weakness all over his body. We should stop. I don't want to go overboard. Liam said promptly as he let go of Theo's arm. Alec was told of the process, but it was his first time taking somebody's pain. In hindsight, he did quite well considering the amount of hurt he pulled from the chimera. Both wolves seemed relieved after letting go, their heavy breaths filling the otherwise quiet room. Think he's gonna be fine? Asked Alec as he tried to steady his respiration. Yeah, it's Theo. He came back from hell once. He can definitely do it again. I'm sure of it. They were plunged in darkness for a very brief instant before the lights started flickering, on and off again at irregular intervals of time. Their gaze shifted upwards as they looked at the ceiling, eyebrows furrowed. What's happening? Quizzed Alec in a hushed and wary tone. Liam chose to remain quiet. The lights were back on, but an eerie itch niggled at him. In his world, flickering lights at the hospital were never a good omen, especially with the situation they had their hands full with at that time. Chapter 27. To Icon. If there was one matter that the entire population of Beacon Hills could unanimously agree upon, it would be the fact that Icon House was one hell of a dreadful place. The last person to ever set foot in it was the Sheriff Stilinski, the day he rescued Parrish from the deputies trying to kill him. No one had the courage to approach it. No adventurer or thrill-seeker, no adept of the horror factor dared to either. In fact, there were no plans of reconstructing, remodeling, or repurposing for it whatsoever. It was just abandoned. Everyone just accepted it and left it at that. The first thing Parrish perceived aside from the cursed building itself upon arrival were the 2 police vehicles parked ahead. He apprehensively walked towards them, flashlight in hand, to check for any sign of his colleague. After he exited his own car, that is. When all the hints led him to the unfortunate and unquestionable conclusion he feared, he drew his weapon and prudently approached Icon's entrance. The more he advanced towards that metal door, however, the slower and more hesitant he grew. He couldn't help it. The memories of that place were flooding in at a much higher speed than he could handle. Hellhound or not, flying so close to death on more than one occasion at the hands of multiple people sure scarred him deeply. He simply mismeasured how deep until then, as he was being confronted with the feelings he had curbed for all those years. The deputy came to the realization that he was sweating through his uniform. Standing there, only a few inches away from that damned door, he brought his sight up and glazed over the building's facade, skimming for the courage to at least push through the threshold of the hell. He instantly froze when he locked eyes with one of his colleagues, staring at him through one of the windows. Although something about him seemed quite wrong, his appearance wasn't outright that of a living human being. His gaze satiated with years' worth of hate and grudges. His skin bore the same signs of dryness and cracking as those in Jordan's vision earlier that evening. That was enough for Parrish to ignore all the voices screaming warnings in his head and enter the property. He moved forward very carefully, through the doors, through the hallways. A sickening sense of familiarity overcame him as he walked past the cell where he almost took his last breath. His guard dropped to a rather low level at that moment. The biggest indication of that was the amount of time he took to notice the figure standing at the other end of the corridor. He quickly pointed his gun in its direction before slowly lowering it, eyes wide with astonishment. "Sanders?" he called out. Sanders, or what looked like a standing corpse version of him, didn't react to his own name whatsoever. He instead turned away at a steady pace and disappeared to his right down the hallway. Parrish followed suit, but couldn't catch up to him in time. Sanders had vanished behind that corner. "Sanders?" Jordan called out again, this time louder, and most importantly, in vain. At least it was until a far-sounding voice reached his ears. "Parrish? Parrish, I'm here," she screamed. "Fisher? Where are you?" He had a vague idea about where her voice was coming from. The darkened route Sanders took to vanish. He reluctantly accepted that it was the route he needed to take. Wherever she was, she didn't sound like she could wait for much longer. Her tone was heavy with urgency, and so Parrish did his very best to move as fast as he could while remaining vigilant. "Fisher?" He called for her again. He began to grow more anxious because of the lack of response he was getting, but what he disliked the most in that setting was the unsettling feeling that he was walking in a straight line to no end. He literally couldn't see any end to that hallway. The more he went, the more he felt like the walls were stretching forward, as little as he could view of them through the thick layers of darkness. His disconcert escalated higher when he picked up on a nauseating metallic scent. Faint at first, though becoming more pervasive the further he proceeded down that path. He was nearing something he was sure he could never unsee. His heart skipped a beat. He immediately regretted wishing for an end to the corridor he was running through. As soon as it was granted, he was assaulted with the mortifying reality, the disturbing fate of his colleagues. Vince, Sanders, Wilson, Gibbs, and their youngest recruit, Reyes, were lined horizontally, all hanged by their necks, with fishing lines, so thin that Parrish thought they were only floating before the realization sunk in. Chapter 28. Ansa. Chris nodded politely towards one of the deputies as he crossed the yellow tape at the crime scene. Had he been anybody else, he wouldn't have had that privilege. Making his way to the manor's door, but stopping in his tracks once he turned around to find himself alone. Nolan nowhere to be seen. Eyebrows furrowed, head turning from left to right and back and forth. Argent decided to walk back to his car where he found Nolan, just sitting in the passenger seat, entranced by the police car lights as they continuously flashed between red and blue. Chris slowly approached the car door, nearing the young man. No mind-reading powers were needed to decipher his thoughts, or work out the reason he wasn't moving, although Nolan seemed very well aware of his surroundings, because he rolled the window down to hear whatever Chris had to say. "You were one of the first people she hurt," uttered Chris calmly, before continuing. "I'll understand if you don't want to go in." "I don't think I'll forgive myself if I don't," Nolan replied in the same tone. "Still, you can take some time if you want." After hearing those words, Nolan put on the best determined look he could muster on his face before opening and pushing the door open. This time he did walk behind Chris. The wheels in his head kept spinning relentlessly. He was one of the first feeble-minded minions that Monroe enjoyed manipulating and controlling. Those were his words when describing his past behavior, and while forgiving was an option, forgetting, unfortunately, could not be one. "Chris," Scott called out when they stepped into the basement. "Scott," Argent motioned towards Scott, before turning to Braden and addressing her. "Glad to see you're back in town, Marshal." "You were right, Nolan," Scott asked when he noticed the silence of the young man. "Yeah, fine," he simply replied, though his eyes betrayed him when he kept staring intensely at the spot where the bodies were found. "You said they were sacrificed?" Chris butted in. "Yeah, and according to Lydia and the other banshee, that's not the worst part," said Scott. "I'm assuming the worst part had to do with who did it?" Argent asked again. This time he sounded more cautious. "It's the same person you fought 4 years ago." Nolan finally decided to break his silence with that question. "I completely trust Lydia's words on this, so yeah, I have to accept it." Scott stated more to himself than anyone else. "So, she's back from the dead? Did that banshee give any details on how she was brought back to life?" "I didn't stay long enough to hear that part of the story," Scott spoke again. Chris had more questions. "What about the creatures that attacked you? Can they be connected?" "Yes, I think. I'll have to hear more about it from her, though, just to be sure." Nolan snapped his attention onto something else, it appeared. He seemed to be casing the scene again, with a different air on his face. Confusion. "Where is Malia?" the young man asked. "Or Peter, for that matter," he added. "Not here. Why?" quizzed Brayden. They left the hospital a while before we did. She said she was heading here. Now that Nolan pointed it out, Chris's interest was also piqued. They probably made a stop somewhere. Scott wasn't entirely convinced by his own words. Having more than one supernatural enemy on their tail wasn't really a blessing for their numbers. Hope so, finished Brayden. Speaking of Malia, she was driving her car with an ambiguous look on her face. What did it translate into? Peter wondered. Was she upset? Was there something she wanted to say to him? Or was she simply worried and uneasy because of the recent events? That was about as much as he could read on her from his peripheral vision. She seemed stiff, too stiff for his comfort. Care to share? He finally asked. Without reverting her gaze from the road, she spoke. Share what exactly? Hell, am I supposed to know? Whatever is grinding your gears. You're not really my first pick for that kind of conversation, she simply answered. You said that before. I'm kind of your only pick right now, considering we're stuck together in this car. He did his best to conceal his hurt. If you think you're stuck with me in this car ride, you really have no right or business blaming me for not talking to you. She clenched her jaw muscles, saying those words, clearly more affected than she wanted to let him believe. I wasn't talking about myself when I said that. Same. You can't speak for me and ask me to talk at the same time. It's either one or the other. Fine. I met Corinne when she was in Beacon Hills on a job. We hit it off and... Oh, you gotta be kidding me. Malia rushed to cut his story off, almost fearing that if he finished it, she'd be forever cursed by his words. What? You were clearly changing the subject. We gotta start somewhere. And you think the best place to start is to remind me of my crazy homicidal mother who tried to kill me too, by the way. With more context, she was referring to the fact that were-coyotes handed down part of their power to their newborns. Corinne, being her mother, tried to take the power that Malia had inherited from her back by killing her, or at least attempting to do so. I don't see you pitching in. Where else can we start in order to build this healthy and normal father-daughter relationship? He instantly quit mid-indignation when Malia slammed her foot on the brakes. God damn it, your driving still sucks, he yelled out as the car wheels squealed harshly against the tar. When they finally found their way back to the calm of the night, she took a deep breath, her hands still gripping the steering wheel and her eyes still fixed ahead. Just for a second. 1 second. Did you think that maybe we're not meant to have a normal relationship? She remained silent for a moment before carrying on. We never were a normal family to begin with. Nothing about us can be qualified as normal. That was never our forte. So consider pulling your weight somewhere else, maybe? Maybe. After her words, that was all he could quietly mutter. By then, she had already restarted the car, and they were on their way again. For now, let's just get to that damn house, she added. They moved steadily since then, each conversing with their own thoughts on the down low. Well, that was until Peter steered the attention on something new. Wait, how come we're still on the road? What do you mean? She was ticked off, but kept on going calmly, waiting for his response. The road to the house is not supposed to be this long. He was alarmed and wary, looking around them from the spaces provided by the windows and the windshield. The sky. Look at the sky, Malia pitched in, as she slowed the car down to allow herself time to look at the night sky, which was pitch black. The darkness had ingested any hint of gleam, beside the luminescence granted by the headlights of the car. I think we drove right into a trap, said Peter, realization dawning on him. They had been driving in some sort of a loop for quite the amount of time. Where the hell are we? Sitting still, in the middle of God knew where, at the edge of their seats, they didn't know what to expect. Neither did they know when to. This is one very, very long night. Peter voiced his thoughts once again. That smell, she pointed out, once her nostrils picked up on a sort of a familiar scent around them. And by this point, they weren't only still, they were petrified. They knew they weren't alone out there. That wasn't the most dreadful part of it all, because then they had an idea on who was creeping around them. Well, mainly what was. Then they heard it, the lowest of growls, also familiar to their ears. That only further confirmed the identity of whatever was surveying them. The voice was unwaveringly climbing in terms of decibels. They were inching closer to the vehicle. Both Malia and Peter turned to face each other, then followed the tone's direction and kept turning to find themselves looking straight towards the back of the car. I think this night is about to get longer, voiced Malia, astonished by the sight that greeted her. Holy crap, added Peter, just as surprised as his daughter. That was the last of their conversation before it, meaning before the berserker put his hand under the rear end of the car and just flipped it upside down.